We're good. Thank
Hi,
you.
are we ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, welcome. Good morning. This is Mindy East with Freedom is Everybody's Job. I'm joined this morning by two of my favorite speakers from Barron Ridge Speakers Agency. Gigi Sabbat is joining us from Florida, and Jim Price of the Jim Price Show is with us, also from my hometown, Wichita, Kansas. We are so honored today to have the co-author of Dr. Peter McCullough's book, John Leake, with us today. Dr. McCullough was unable to attend at the last minute, but we are so grateful for you, Mr. Leake. John, we're happy to have you. And you're out of Dallas this morning, is that right?
I am. By a happy coincidence, Dr. McCullough and I both live in Dallas, Texas. And when we go back to the early days when being on Facebook, we do have to be a little careful the language that we use. So I refer to it as the pandemic. That seems to get by the censors. So when the pandemic started in March of 2020, I was here in Dallas. I'm a true crime author. I began to suspect that the way in which our public health agencies and our media, our mainstream media, was representing the pandemic, I thought there were things that didn't add up. I thought there were implausibilities in this. And I began to suspect that we, the American people and the rest of humanity, were not being told the truth about this. So I began to investigate. I began to think that there might be a story here, and a rather big story, but I knew I needed a top medical authority to help me interpret a lot of the technical stuff. And by a very perhaps even providential coincidence, Dr. McCullough lives just 2 miles away from me. So I saw his Senate testimony on November the 9th, 2020 on C-SPAN, and I then contacted him here in Dallas for a studio interview. A friend of mine's a film producer, and we had a great rapport in our interview. So about a year ago, we decided to write a book together, and it's just come out. The title is The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex.
Very, very powerful.
Well, people are sometimes a little puzzled by the title, the courage to face COVID-19. Does that mean the courage to face the illness? It's a little, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if we should have maybe rejiggered that. But the idea is that COVID-19 has been misrepresented to us. It's like this complex thing that the public has been made to be equally and universally terrified of. And at the same time, we've been told from the very beginning, I mean, from the outset, that there's nothing that can be done about it other than staying at home and waiting for what Dr. McCullough and I say in order to avoid the censors, waiting for this big medicine that is injected into you. All we can do is stay home, social distance, and when the big medicine is finally developed, we can all get the big medicine, and then we can go back to normal life. And I just thought, this doesn't make sense to me. I mean, for various reasons that we discuss in the book.
So, John, I know that you're very highly educated. You attended the University of
Boston University. And to those who are interested in, I would say, kind of political philosophy that might be characterized as libertarian or conservative, I studied with the British political philosopher named Roger Scruton, who is something of an eminence, or was. He passed away just before all of this happened in 2020. Something of an eminence in political philosophy, I would say a critical view of revolutionary politics. So what I have perceived is that the pandemic response has in many ways been hijacked by people who actually do wish to subvert the US Constitution. It's been seized as an instrument for centralized global power. And that centralized global power does not respect the US Constitution.
No, and it's interesting. We are right in a line with what you're saying. We started Freedom is Everybody's Job back when the pandemic hit. We had to pivot a little bit. And so Gigi had just written a book called God First, and one of many books that she's written. And Armando had written a book called The Decay of the Devil's Kingdom, which talked about how we've been basically brainwashed in society and music and with celebrities. And it's just been this dark oppression. So from the get-go, we realized how woefully ignorant we are. I won't speak for everybody on this panel. Of course, Gigi's finishing up her law degree, but most of us in public schools got a very limited taste of what our history and our government is all about. And so I have these treasured historical documents, and it just talked about our freedom and our civil liberties. And Jim can go on more about that. But we wanted to, when the pandemic hit, I thought it's not a pandemic. We're in a constitutional crisis.
I agree with that. I mean, the author of our Constitution, James Madison, I mean, he talked about more in the military context of, a sort of favorite strategy of would-be dictators is to invoke a foreign threat, a foreign military threat of, an army is on the frontier, and if you don't listen to me, the ruler, if you don't grant me emergency power, then we're all going to be overrun and we're all going to get killed and all the women will be hauled off or whatever. That this Madison talks about was a favored technique in ancient Rome. Whenever there were domestic problems on the Italian peninsula, it was a favorite trick of the Roman governing class to say, oh, there's, the Germans are making a move across the Rhine, or there's a rebellion in Judea or whatever. And so you would distract the public away from its own domestic problems and abuses by invoking a foreign threat. And I think what's happened here in the pandemic is it's not a military threat that is being invoked. It's the threat of an emerging infectious disease that's going to insidiously and invisibly spread to every country in the world. And under that threat and the immense fear that has been generated, these ruthless and ambitious politicians and their friends in finance and what we call the biopharmaceutical complex has enabled them to expand their wealth through the creation of government money as a pandemic response, and their power and their centralized control. So the threat is not a military threat that's been invoked. That's what Madison was primarily interested in. It's this threat of an infectious disease. And in a state of fear, we, the citizen, we, the people, have been willing to surrender a lot of our constitutionally protected rights and liberties, which is very, very disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Jim, I know you're wanting to jump in there.
Well, one of the things that I actually found out through this entire thing is how all the fail-safes, I believe, as a society, that we failed. We failed those fail-safes. Those fail-safes, or when people say, you know what, no, this is not how we treat each other. We don't arrest each other for not wearing a mask. We don't arrest each other for, not standing on a circle. We don't talk down to each other. We don't give people who don't have leadership skills or the authority. And I think so many times in situations where police officers or other types of authority in schools or business administrative buildings, they could have really defaulted to freedom and liberty as opposed to doubling down, tripling down, making it worse, arresting people, creating scenes. We've seen this habitually across all those different media platforms. The sad part for me, and I find, is that so many of us, and I say us as a cumulative everybody, complied. and they complied, infinitely. They were going to do everything to make sure everybody else around them is complying as well. And that infectious effect was really mind blowing for me to see how much we can control an entire globe to live in fear, and yet there was nothing to be fearful of.
Well, we talk about this in our book, I think the easiest way to break this down is, excuse me, the state has always had a monopoly on violence. We say individual citizens, you can't go around punching someone in the face or shooting them or stabbing them or whatever. And if you do, if the individual capacity for aggression and violence, that is something in which the state reserves the right to step in. Humans can be violent. We can harm each other physically. So the state can step in to prevent you from harming someone by physical violence. With this infectious disease pandemic, what the state said is you could be harboring a virus that you could transmit to those around you, thereby resulting in harm to them, not in quite the same immediate way as if you punch them in the face or hit them, or shot them with a pistol, but you could do severe harm to them by virtue of harboring and transmitting the virus. So that was the mechanism whereby the state assumed all of this power, and the fear of being in the presence of someone who may be harboring the virus and may transmit it to you, thereby harming you, was sufficient in the minds of a large enough people to enable this scheme to be effected. So that's what happened. And then in your discussions, and I'm sure all of you had them, you're trying to sit there and talk reason to someone who's terrified, and you can't. If someone is gripped with fear, it's fight or flight. They don't just sit there and contemplate and weigh the risk benefit analysis of what's really going on. The fearful mind will comply. And dictators have always known that, which is why they like fearful situations.
Right.
Wow, that's very insightful. I had a friend sit in my living room and just grill me. And I finally said, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how afraid are you of the pandemic? And she said, oh, a 10. And I said, well, I'm a 0. That's why it's just, and you're right. I hadn't thought of it that way. But Jim, what do you always say? We're asking people to change their religion when it's such a big deal for them.
Well, a lot of this is this pattern driven. Human beings horribly pattern driven, no matter what they're doing. We think that we're not doing the same thing at the same time every morning, but if you really start watching the clock, what time you get up, what time you brush your teeth, what time you put your socks on, what time you're grabbing your keys, they're all very within a range of a few minutes. And so what this did is it showed a lot of people that, that you always follow the government, you always follow the news, you always follow this, and they're there to help you. The greatest gaslighting moment of our life was that we have a free and fair press and the government's here to help. There's absolutely nothing factual about those statements. And yet everybody really fell into line on this. But then when you say, listen, I don't think this is what it is. I don't think this thing is really as bad as it is. The Mexican beer flu is not going to kill you. And the problem with it is so many people, you would tell them that, and they would just be in awe. Like, how dare you blaspheme my deadly virus? This is what I want. I have to hold on to this. It's going to kill me. And when you say, listen, you don't have to live in fear, it really bothers them. And it really is a mind grind for them to actually try to figure out how to think of things differently. And it's like changing the religion. No longer is the kitchen chair in your kitchen the God that you thought it was your entire life. When you walk out the front door, suddenly there's a different world. And I think a lot of people got to learn that. A lot of people did. Really, it was amazing transformation. But the initial impact of people actually accepting blindly, that was terrifying.
Well, I mean, fear and propaganda work. I mean, we have to give the devil his due. I mean, they do. I mean, they work very effectively, and there's plenty of historical evidence that that's how humans will respond to this stimulus. So what's been weird to me, the thing that I still don't think I understand, and I kind of hit my head on the wall over it, and I still don't understand. what happened to people who characterize themselves as classical liberals? So let's say that, I grew up in a classical liberal family. Maybe my parents were sort of, let's just make it almost a cliche. My parents were intellectuals in New York City. Mom worked for the local Democratic Party chapter. I grew up in the traditions of classical liberalism of the Democratic Party, going back to Robert F. Kennedy, our Franklin Delano Roosevelt. How did that cohort, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being the most fascinating example of the guy that did stick with those core principles, how did that cohort of classical liberal thinking just get completely wholesale dumped with this centralized power, almost, well, you hear people who characterize themselves as liberals advocating censorship, advocating central government control, advocating mandating experimental medical products. It's like, how did that happen? And I still don't know. I'm still very, I'm going into the realm of how people identify themselves. And I don't understand how that cohort who's traditionally identified themselves as classical liberals has embraced all of this fascism. I don't, it's just a mystery.
Well, and that's there's two analogies that go with that. One is the orchestra effect, and the other would be is how bureaucracy itself really does touch or puts its finger on the scale daily. Now, when you listen to an orchestra, there is a central command, right? There's a central person, the conductor, right? The person who's setting the tempo, bringing instruments in, sections in, looking at a guy when he knows he messed up. The amazing part is I know we have a very centrally located authority figure, and I understand who those people really are. But what's amazing is how much auto coming in and out of this entire thing, these different pieces did. I'm talking about from the bureaucracy to laws to the street sweeper to the recorder at the county courthouse to the judges. Some of these judges and stuff that I have known over the years, you talk to them personally, they're like, I ain't worried about nothing. But then you go into the courtroom and you see them in their job, and they are horrible dictatorships inside their courtroom and other places, telling you what you have to do and how you will do it. It's really amazing how this orchestra really created, all the pieces really came together, and everybody been taught to do their piece. Everybody taught to do their part, come in at the right time, get out at the right time, do all these things. And yes, there was an orchestrated effect, but it was amazing how so much of it was so automatic. Nobody had to turn on the switch and say, hey, we're going to do this now. Everybody's like, oh, we're doing this now. Cool. Like they just went with it. That right there, this is the psychology of it that really does bother me the most, is how much the bureaucracy, but then also the orchestra just kicked right in for everybody.
I think what you said about people being creatures of habit, may be the key to all of this. If you have people who are reading and watching in a very preferential way, particular sources of information and particular representations of the world, you're right. It's like, well, I've always listened to Anderson Cooper. He's, good looking, or he was, he actually was a very brave reporter in his youth. I don't know what happened to the guy, but let's say that you just listen to him all the time. Right. Well, all he does is interview people like Bill Gates. He's done no investigative work. He's just receives the script from his bosses at CNN, who presumably pay him a great deal, and he just reads the script. Well, if that's the guy you've been listening to for 15 years, and that's an ingrained, I guess you'll believe him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where the kitchen chair is your God. So your entire life, your parents told you kitchen chair is God. You believe that, right? And if you don't break that cycle, then you'll spend your entire life doing it. Whereas 18, you walk out and suddenly everybody thinks you're a nut because you believe the chair is God. But that's really the analogy you're using as well with Cooper, is that, people sit there and stare at this guy and think that he's somebody because he used to do something great. And then they've allowed that to perpetuate forward. And it really, he's just reading a script that somebody else put in front of him. He's a great reader. but not really a great reporter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. Well, there's another element that we go into. I mean, and Dr. McCullough, I mean, he is a foremost advocate of the early treatment of COVID-19. And so the way this was represented to the public is that it poses an equal lethal threat to everybody, from a young athlete all the way up to, someone who's surpassed life expectancy and is knocking on heaven's door and a nursing home. It was presented to the public as an equal threat to the entire population. And we know from studying the history of medicine that this just can't be true. Mm-hmm. I mean, what's often invoked is the Spanish flu of 1918, which did kill young people for reasons that to this day are not fully understood. The average age of death of the Spanish flu in 1918 was 28 years old. Now, that is scary. I mean, it's like, you're some young, healthy guy or girl, and this thing will kill you. So I think that's been the sort of threat that has been invoked ever since. We could get another Spanish flu. Now, what's oftentimes not mentioned about the Spanish flu is that the virulence was almost certainly amplified by all this military. It's at the closing year of the First World War. You have millions and millions of men in close quarters and trenches. There's a very, very distinct disease ecology that was in place then. And the second thing is people almost certainly died of secondary staphylococcal infection of the lungs that could have today been treated with antibiotics. There's actually secondary bacterial pneumonia that was very likely killing all of those people, easily treated today. When SARS-CoV-2 arrived, it was, it's going to be like the Spanish flu. It'll kill young people. And we know that it hasn't killed young people in a statistically significant way at all. I mean, it really, if you're young and healthy and have a good set of lungs and a good heart, and you don't have leukemia or something, this isn't going to kill you. I mean, when I say it's not going to kill you, I mean, young people die in car accidents every year, and we don't think twice about saying that, you can't get a driver's license till you're 21. I mean, I don't know the last time that was proposed, but you talk to an insurance man and he'll say 16 to 17-year-olds, they're pretty dangerous. A lot of them get killed every year. So we just kind of threw out any kind of perspective with SARS-CoV-2. The second element of this is that there are certain groups of people in our population for whom it does pose a threat. The most obvious high-risk groups are people who suffer from metabolic diseases like diabetes, people who are morbidly obese, and the very old. Those people can get into trouble with COVID-19 illness, and they did get into trouble with it. Now, where this becomes a really dark chapter in our book is quickly it was ascertained that there are certain repurposed drugs that could help these people, but they were relentlessly suppressed. And this is really the main theme of our book, is the suppression of early outpatient treatment for high-risk people that could have helped to keep them out of hospital and dying. And this is the crime element of our true crime book, is the suppression of early therapy.
So Gigi, I know you've got some great thoughts since you've got the background in law. What would you like to bring to the table at this point?
Absolutely. Well, John, what are your thoughts on the mask mandates?
Well, I mean, these mandates, every time the government can just say, by emergency decree, we're mandating that everyone wear a mask, or we're mandating that everyone get the big medicine injection. I mean, this is just clearly and there's no time frame placed on it. It's just like indefinitely. If you go to the airport, you have to wear a mask by federal mandate. I really do see this. There are two elements. There's the underlying science. Is there any reason to believe that completely healthy, asymptomatic people should be wearing a mask? Well, there is no scientific grounds for mandating. I mean, that's the funny thing. Even Anthony Fauci himself in the early days said, well, it doesn't make sense for otherwise healthy people to be walking around wearing a mask. I mean, the Pope himself said that this makes sense. Later, he flip-flops for reasons that, aren't clear. I don't like mandates unless they have an obvious, clear and present danger utility. I mean, in other words, if there are armed men going down your street, and it's for real. I mean, there are armed men going down your street, posing a major threat to public safety. Yes, during the described period of that public emergency, I think an executive could say, I'm mandating that everyone stay at home until this clear and present danger is neutralized. The problem with the pandemic is it's just this open-ended. We'll just keep declaring an emergency indefinitely. I mean, there's still a state of emergency legally or officially. So if you just declare an indefinite state of emergency with no temporal, no standards of evaluating, is this an emergency? And that being a criterion for keeping it in place, then the government can just do whatever they want. There's a Woody Allen film from the early 70s called Bananas. And this guy comes to power, this dictator comes to power in some Latin American country. And he says, well, I'm your new leader. From now on, everyone will speak Swedish. And from now on, everyone will wear underwear outside of their pants. It's just like it becomes like a comedy where everyone has to wear a mask. Everyone has to get an injection. Everyone has to stand 6 feet apart. Well, why not? I mean, it just begins to seem arbitrary. But my real concern, I'm sorry I'm droning on too long, is that if you grant the power to impose mandate to central government, I do get very concerned about the slippery slope. It's like once we get conditioned to accept this, now we're conditioned to accept the next mandatory thing, no matter how arbitrary it may be.
Well, like monkeypox, for example, I think there have been 5 deaths nationwide, and they're trying to move that into an emergency status as well. John, let me ask you this. The CDC and the FDA have grossly overstepped their boundaries, and along with the same line of thinking that you were just discussing. What do you think should happen now? What happens next?
Well, I mean, the first thing that needs to happen is the general public, and I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, needs to understand factually what has happened for the last 2.5 years. I mean, what are the facts of what's happened for the last 2.5 years? And I think there are positive signs that maybe the truth is getting out. I mean, Dr. Deborah Birx gave this very strange interview with Neil Cavuto on Fox, in which she said, well, I knew from the beginning that the vaccines wouldn't prevent infection.
That was weird.
You knew that from the beginning. I mean, so why were you mandating them? I mean, in other words, you knew that one person, whether he be vaxxed or unvaxxed, did not present a transmission threat more to one than the other. So why did you mandate this? So I think maybe people will start to get the memo. More and more people will start to get the memo. And once more and more people start to understand what has happened, I mean, that's why we wrote the book, is so people can understand. We've written it in a very easy to read language. It's in a narrative, it's a story. People call it a page turner. I think as people understand what has happened, then the citizenry, the prudent citizenry that our founding fathers had in mind, will be in a position to assess, who should we hold accountable, what agencies, what politicians, and the people need to reach that level of awareness where they're ready, able, and willing to hold our government accountable.
Don't you think that this scandal, this scheme, this whatever, this big thing in your arm, don't you think that's going to go down in history as one of the biggest crimes against humanity?
I think people will ultimately, and it may take a while, will ultimately draw that conclusion. Widespread public consciousness, public awareness, tends to lag. I think it was the German philosopher Schopenhauer who said that all truth goes through 3 distinct stages. First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and then ultimately it's accepted as self-evident. So, I think we were working our way through the ridicule and the violent opposition. And ultimately, I think more and more people will realize, oh my God, how could we have been such suckers? I mean, what a fraud. How could this fraud have been perpetrated on such a mass scale? But it may take a while.
So, Gigi, I want to give you some chances to speak some more. What other questions would you like to ask John?
Absolutely. John, why do you believe some folks who have gotten the vaccine have still passed away, unfortunately?
Well, I mean, the vaccine, or what's called the vaccine, it's actually a genetic transfer technology. It's not a vaccine in the traditional sense of immunology. The head of Bayer Pharmaceuticals, Stefan Ulrich, actually stated this at a World Health Conference in October of last year. He said, if the public had understood, that this is a genetic transfer technology, they would have probably been reluctant to get it. I mean, he actually just comes out and says it. So it's not a vaccine in the traditional sense, going back to Pasteur and Jonas Salk and some of these guys that developed earlier vaccines. It's a new technology, and there are a lot of things about this new technology that was developed in great haste that still aren't understood. There are what epidemiologists call signals that are very disturbing about the safety of the big medicine. Some of the obvious ones that have been actually acknowledged by the manufacturers and acknowledged by the FDA, for example, are myocarditis in young males. I mean, the media doesn't report it, but the FDA has actually acknowledged it. They're characterizing it as a rare side effect, but it can cause heart inflammation in young people. So they're dying because, first of all, in some instances, the injection itself kills them. It causes heart inflammation and they die in their sleep, or they die on the football field. When you talk about why do older people who could be susceptible of dying of COVID-19, why are they dying? Well, it's because the injection doesn't confer immunity. I mean, it doesn't prevent infection from the illness. So if you are part of this high risk group who could become severely ill with it, the vaccine's not going to help you. There is just an assertion it will prevent severe illness, but that's just an assertion. There's no evidence. There's no randomized trial data that is convincing, sufficiently convincing to draw that conclusion. It's just an assertion. It's like me just saying, I'm not 52, I'm 38. I mean, well, prove it. Prove that you're not 52. No, I assure you, I'm only 38 years old. I mean, so I think that the public needs to be aware that the fraud that has been perpetrated, it's not a sophisticated fraud. It's out in the open. I mean, Deborah Birx herself just said that it doesn't prevent infection. So, I mean, you heard it directly from the top.
I think her strategy is something big's coming, and I think she's trying to avoid some issues there by coming forth and openly stating that.
It does look like she's trying to get ahead of something. I mean, I was talking with Dr. McCullough yesterday. It's like, well, assuming that she's a rational actor, that she's not just sort of lost the script or confused or hungover or something. I mean, if she is a rational actor, like, what is she up to? And, we were talking about this at lunch, and we agreed, well, she must know something, and she's trying to get ahead of it.
Well, the documents were released on her actually in I want to say it was 2015 or 2014, where she was already in an agreement with Moderna, the federal government, and her in a non-disclosure contract that doesn't allow them to talk about how actually the federal government does own half of the government chemical that they're trying to give away to you. And here's another interesting fact in this whole thing. I was just at Dillon's or Kroger's. Everybody knows Kroger's, a nationwide chain out of Europe. This, by the way, nationwide food chain based out of Europe, guys. We all depend on our food sources from Europe. Think about that. Anyway, they had a huge basket right there by the checkout stand of $20 COVID, I'm going to say it, COVID tests. So you're going to pay what I thought we paid for all these up front, but now they're trying to sell them at the retail level at the counter at Kroger's. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but the Birx thing, where there's a contract out there that shows that she's in a complete agreement on a non-disclosure contract with the federal government having ownership in the vaccine. I mean, there's a lot of things I think are coming out, and it's not going to look good no matter who you are. And it's, the history always kind of tells the real story, right?
Well, I mean, the NIAID co-owned the patent on the Moderna messenger RNA vaccine. I mean, that was never concealed. I mean, the media did, you didn't see Anderson Cooper talking about it, but right. I mean, you just kind of dig around a little bit, and you see that Anthony Fauci's division of the National Institutes of Health co-owns the patent to the Moderna mRNA vaccine, and they thrust that thing into human trials 5 days after it was declared an emergency, and they did this rapid warp speed development of it with government money. DARPA, the various government agencies funded it. The NIAID was a chief funder. And Fauci, who's supposed to be an objective arbiter of pandemic response, his outfit, and possibly he personally, he's dodged the question when it was presented by Senator Rand Paul. He has an economic interest in a particular specific pandemic response. So just gross conflicts of interest. Yeah. But ultimately, I think the founding fathers would say that if the citizenry consists of inveterate, insistent dumbasses that don't learn anything, that have no intellectual curiosity, that don't study the Constitution, don't learn, then, I mean, maybe it's our own fault. I mean, I'm sorry I'm being a little bit intemperate, but it's like, at what point do you have a critical mass of the citizenry that it's so obvious that you're being defrauded? Mm-hmm. Why do we still have so many people that play along with this nonsense? I mean, I'm just being sour grapes.
I think what's lacking, John, is the ability to be a critical thinker. And, so many things have changed, and we're being told, oh, that's not what it's called anymore. For example, my thing with the whole vaccine was it wasn't a vaccine. It was an experimental drug therapy approved by emergency use only. And so if That was too hard to say in a sentence. It was just easier to call it what they wanted us to think it was. But I think Jim's right. We're just so accustomed to just going along with the flow. We're raised to be good servants or good employees and good kids. And, there comes a time when we have to stand up, speak up, and show up and say, you know what, this is why we're doing this. Freedom is everybody's job. We cannot wait for somebody, an elected official in our state capital or a nation's capital to run interference for us. We have to do it on our own.
But I mean, I would go one step further. I mean, it's true that for all citizens of a constitutional republic, defending our constitutionally protected liberties, it's everybody's job. I completely agree. But I'm actually going one step further, applying basic common sense, basic deductive reasoning to public health issues or any issue that's being presented to us. That is everybody's job. People need, a requirement of being a good citizen is think. Don't just read your propaganda organ and just accept that everything that you're being spoon-fed is factual reality. Apply some deductive reasoning. Do a little bit of critical analysis on this. I mean, so where am I going with this? How could any citizen of a constitutional republic agree to something of this terms, on these terms? You have to get this an experimental injection or you'll lose your job. The manufacturer of the experimental injection will receive all of the funds for developing, for marketing, and a pre-purchase from the government. They will receive the entire economic benefit, hundreds of billions of dollars, even though the government was provided a lot of the capital to develop it, no marketing costs. And even though you, citizen, have to receive it in order to retain your job, they, the manufacturer, will bear no liability if you're injured. What kind of citizen would agree to those terms? It's the stupidest thing that I think has ever been presented. But people just say, oh, give it to me. I don't want to lose my job as, whatever. I mean, you guys can see I've been doing this for a while now. And there are moments, maybe I've had too much caffeine or something, that I do become a little bit intemperate, but to speak in a more grown-up way, I do hope that our citizenry will realize what happened. I hope that people will read our book, The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex. It's a fun book. We worked really hard on it. Buy our book. I'm now going to do the sales pitch. It's on Amazon, or go to our website, couragetofacecovid.com. And I think that when they read the book, that they will understand what happened, share it with their friends. That friend of yours who's a 10 of fear, give her a copy. She probably won't read it. And maybe our citizenry will understand what happened, and we can start holding these villains in Washington accountable. And with that sales pitch, I have another podcast in 2 minutes.
Okay. We're so honored to have you, John. And Jim, real quick, how can people find your show?
Jim Price at thejimpriceshow.com is my email. Thejimpriceshow.com is the website. So look me up and I'll get back with you.
And Gigi, thank you for everything. John, it was an honor and a privilege to have you, and best wishes on continued success.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everybody. Y'all are really super fun and cool. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.